The Titanic carried 3,300 passengers and crew. Nearly half of them lost their lives on the night of April 14, 1912. But the stories of the Titanic live on. On the ship were millionaires, artists, fashionistas, bakers, cookers, musicians, doctors, and con men. These are their stories. Welcome to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on the Last Night on the Titanic. We are looking at the cast of characters that made up the fateful night for when the ship went down. Joined as always by my co-host on the series, Veronica Hinke. Veronica, how are you?
Hi, Scott. I'm well and looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, we set the things up in our previous episode where we introduced what the series was going to be about and trying to get out of the simple narrative that most people would know about the Titanic, probably because they just saw the movie in 97 and just think about things in terms of first, second, and third class. But there's way more to it. And the first person we're going to look at is Charles Joughin, who is a baker, but he happened to make his way into the different film accounts of the Titanic. So maybe that's a good place to start. Who is Charles Joughin and how was he represented in the two film versions about the Titanic?
Well, Scott, like you point out, so much of what we've seen and heard about the Titanic is those many faces. And who were those people? Like Charles, for instance, he was the head baker aboard the Titanic. We see him in those comic relief type scenes where he's the baker with the baker's cap on and he's hanging on to the railings as people are running up the poop deck at the very end before the Titanic sinks. And, it's meant in Hollywood speak to be sort of a comic relief moment, but it's actually a story about a very, very unfortunate man, but he survived in the end. And his story is incredible.
He was one of the first people to see the iceberg. Is that correct?
Well, he saw the iceberg and he told his nieces and nephews about it after he survived. And it was one of the ways that he masked the horrors of the night that he went through. He didn't talk about any of the bad things, but he talked about seeing that iceberg. And he told his family, I knew it was an iceberg when I saw it because I saw a polar bear and he waved at me.
How does he show up in the two movies? I haven't seen A Night to Remember. Is there actually a scene of him seeing a polar bear, or how does he show up in these works of The Night to Remember and then the James Cameron Titanic film?
Well, the polar bear sighting is a story from one of his family members. His great niece, who's in New Jersey, shared that with me. And it was one of the dear memories that she holds close about her great uncle. And in the movie, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, the scene is where Charles and others are running up the poop deck, Jack and Rose, the two main characters of the movie, and they're desperately trying to stay away from the water as long as they can. The water, of course, was somewhere around 28 degrees that night. So the whole intent was to get as high up as they could as the Titanic pointed north and started to descend underneath. And in that scene, we see Charles running with the group, hundreds of people. And that actually happened, Scott. He told the officers during the British inquiry after the Titanic that he was taking a break. He was drinking a glass of water in a little galley that he found. And as he was drinking a glass of water, he noticed, just like the scene in the James Cameron movie, he noticed these people rushing the deck, just the one, actually the poop deck. And that is when he tells his story about how he became part of this group and was within moments in the water. He said that his life vest was so effective. It was filled with cork, and it helped him so much that he said that his hair never even got wet.
Another thing too from the movies is that he's does he have a whiskey flask? Is it he's drinking? Is that right?
Yeah, in the movie, you see him with a whiskey flask. And the folklore that's been heavily attached to this over the years has always been, the belief has always been that Charles was drinking whiskey. And in talking with his family members, we learned that he was not drinking whiskey that night. He told the British inquiry officials that he was drinking, but he told his family that it was schnapps, in fact, not whiskey. And Scott, back in those days, it was not uncommon in the staff quarters, the crew quarters, where the bunks were, where they slept, to find jerry-rigged stills for where they made whiskey, brandy, all sorts of different things. And Charles, being the head baker, would have more than likely had plenty of access to wheat for making whiskey, fruit and yeast for making all kinds of different things like schnapps, brandy. So it's not uncommon at all to think that that was the case. And what's more is the heart-wrenching story that I found in my research as to why he started drinking that night. And that story is just very inspiring.
Yeah, so let's get into his background. For Charles Joughin, had he only started working at sea in the last few years, or was this something that he had been doing throughout his life?
So Charles was 33 when he was aboard the Titanic, and so by no means was this a new. As we look at all the different people in the book, there are examples of people who are new to working on a ship, some that had been involved in working on a ship a little bit. Charles was one of the veterans. He began working at sea as a child. He was a child laborer, and he knew very well the lifestyle of how people would live in towns like Southampton, where he boarded the Titanic, and he lived with his two babies and his wife. And being in Southampton at that time was sort of on a par with Queens, New York, where there are tons and several apartment buildings where there are crew members of airlines, where they share apartments, sometimes 20, 25 to an apartment in bunks. Southampton was like that in those days. And when I spoke with Charles's great niece, she mentioned how when the Titanic went down, she made the point that an entire town went with it. And that town was Southampton. And that is because so many of the crew, like Charles did, would live there and spend a couple months with their families. Sometimes they wouldn't be actually living there year round, but they'd just live there for a few months and try to, catch their next gig on the sea. And when the Titanic was getting ready to sail, there was a coal strike on. So it was very difficult to get work then. However, Charles was one of the people who was able to get work, as were many of the staff of the Titanic, because they had previously worked on the sister ship of the Titanic, which was the Olympic. So Charles, found this opportunity, and it was an incredible honor, and back then, for the people that got those jobs, to be aboard this majestic ship, the Titanic. It was the biggest and the most glamorous of its time ever before. It was intended to set records beyond belief, and any crew member on board, including Charles, would have been very grateful for the opportunity.
And was he always working as a baker when he had these roles on these different ships?
No, actually, he worked up through the years. His story is an incredible one of working hard and being promoted. And in addition to working in baking capacities, he also worked in all sorts of different capacities. I'm sure whatever he could find, pretty much, whether it be, working as a kitchen aide, supporting other chefs and bakers, and that sort of thing. Charles was actually trained, as he had time off from his jobs at sea. He was trained to be a fine pastry chef. So he delighted in making things like beautiful chocolate eclairs and Napoleons. He was known for making lovely, beautiful christening cakes. His great niece was excited to tell me about a beautiful christening cake that he made with hand-blown sugar that he made for the top. The sugar formed a cradle, and the family kept it forever. And one of the reasons we chose chocolate eclairs for this section of the book, a recipe by Gail Gand, is because Charles loved to make chocolate eclairs for his family. So recipes like that are interspersed throughout the book. It's a culinary narrative, of course. So we have recipes that are dedicated to people. And in this case, we wanted to dedicate something very special to Charles in honor of his history as a fine pastry chef.
Well, let's get to the big moment after the Titanic strikes the iceberg on Sunday night, April 14th at 11:40. And this is when things kick into high gear. So where is Charles and what happens with him?
You're right. This is when things kick into really high gear. And this is when Charles is faced with some of the most trying moments of his life. At 11:40, when the Titanic struck the iceberg, Charles was in his bunk. He was reading, and he was startled, like so many passengers and crew were, at 11:40 that night. It was a Sunday night, and he and his crew were sort of kicking back, getting ready to go to bed for getting up in the morning for another hard day at sea. The days were long and hard, and they were resting when they could. He got up and went and found out what was going on. When he saw that they were loading lifeboats, having been a veteran crew at sea, he knew to look to his checklist. Okay, what do I need to do? He asked himself, when they're loading lifeboats, the first thing on my checklist is, or one of the first things is, I need to load bread loaves into the lifeboats. So he's set to task, shaking up his crew, getting them awake, and sending them up with loaves of bread. There were also bickies in the lifeboats, or biscuits. They were nicknamed bickies, and they were made of just a real basic mix of flour, salt, and some baking powder. And there are recipes for bickies in the book. And the bickies were standard staple on lifeboats for sustenance. So those two things were in, at least for sure, some of the lifeboats. Then Charles went, after the lifeboats were loaded with bread and bickies, he went up to start helping load the lifeboats. And at this point, he is seeing that, some of the women are reluctant to board the lifeboats. You would have to jump sometimes several levels to get into a boat. A lot of people thought they would be safer on the ship than in a lifeboat. So there was, a lot of hesitation on the part of the passengers to board. So he helps board lifeboats. And when he gets to lifeboat 10, which is his assigned lifeboat, he helps board it. It becomes completely boarded. And, I mentioned a little bit earlier about why he was drinking that night. And I think everyone can understand when I tell you this story why. When it came time for the lifeboat to be staffed, the officers in charge of staffing the boat did not give Charles the command to board lifeboat 10 and to command it. They gave the orders to 3 other staff, and those crew members boarded, and they went out on lifeboat 10. And, Charles went and continued to help where he could. And he told the British inquiry officials that was when he went back down to his bunk, had a drink, and came back up a little while later. And he noticed that all the lifeboats were gone at this point. Can you imagine?
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
No lifeboats left on the Titanic. Yeah. And just thinking of that kind of feeling, I myself, this story was so emotional for me to learn about and to tell and to have that responsibility of telling it well. And I said to a friend of mine at the time, this is just really a hard year for me to do this because my mother had just passed away unexpectedly. She had recently gotten married to someone after my father passed away. And out of the blue, she was in perfect health. She had just turned 74. And she passed away just very unexpectedly. We were all shocked. And 6 months after that, I was diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer. And just a lot of things going on for me that it was not the easiest thing to do, to come home from work and work on research and writing that was required to complete this project. And at one point when I was sharing this with my friend about this story about Charles and how he found the strength to survive and fight for his survival the way he did, she pointed out to me that, these stories are a gift. And they're a gift to all of us, Scott, the things that these people went through. And with each person that I researched as I went through this project, I found in every one of them, this incredible will for survival. And, I faced that myself this year where, you used to think to yourself, what if you went on deck and all the lifeboats were gone? How would you feel? When I was a little girl, I almost drowned. My family and I, the four of us, were on the Wisconsin River, and our canoe capsized, and the water was probably about as cold as it was that night for Charles and the others aboard the Titanic. It was very cold, but we were rescued by some fishermen, and everything was okay. But I know that feeling of being close to not making it. So I think, many of the ways that I came into this project and found the strength, the energy to complete it has been with, finding the survival in these people and being inspired by them. And with Charles, when he saw that the lifeboats were gone, he did not just cave and give in. He saw the deck chairs that were still on deck, and these were heavy wooden chairs that were kind of sprawling. You could lay down on them. They were similar to what a Chase lounge would look like today, like a lawn chair at the beach type of thing, only they were wooden, very heavy wooden. And he thought, if I can get these deck chairs into the water through the portholes, because the railing was too high to get them over, maybe there'll be one for me to hang on to when I get into the water, because he knew he was going to hit that water. And so Charles single-handedly began throwing deck chairs into the ocean to prepare himself, rather than saying, well, boy, this is a terrible fate and I have to just accept it. He was finding things to do to help himself survive.
At this point, too, the Titanic, it's already starting to lean over to the side, I think the port side. And can you paint a picture where lifeboat number 10 is located, where he is trying to get off the ship? How is the ship leaning? I think there was a woman who was trying to jump to a boat, and then she ended up dangling upside down because she missed it on the first jump. So how is the ship oriented at this point as he's throwing deck chairs into the water and trying to figure out how he can escape and survive?
You're right. It was leaning to one side and it was not even. So I always think of that too. What was it like trying to keep their footing when they were trying to do things like throwing deck chairs overboard? As far as the specifics about, the Titanic was pointing upwards. And as far as the specifics, I know that he was on a deck throwing chairs over.
So what happens after he throws some of the deck chairs down? Then does he go somewhere else in the ship, or what happens?
That's when he goes and has a drink of water. He finds a small galley and takes a drink. And that's when almost immediately he sees the hundreds of passengers running up the deck. And we can assume that these were probably passengers from third class steerage who were able to get up to the poop deck at that time. So he becomes part of that group. He's just sort of swallowed up by them, and becomes part of the group. And inevitably, they all hit the water. And Charles tread water for 2 hours that night, 28 degrees. And, the comic relief part of it being people making the comment, well, because of the alcohol that he drank. And there's all this debate about, was it the alcohol or would it help you or not? Or, personally, from what I've been able to decipher from the research, I don't think he had that much alcohol that it would have made a difference. I think it's just more probably folklore that's developed because Charles was so transparent with the British inquiry officials, and he admitted that he drank that night. And I think it just became this, piece of Titanic folklore, an incredible one, but a folklore nonetheless. So he's treading water. As I said earlier, he said his hair doesn't even get wet. He is one of many, many people that night who are not able to get onto a lifeboat because anyone that was on a lifeboat would be thinking, oh gosh, if I, let someone else on this lifeboat, it may capsize. So, he found an overturned lifeboat with many different men on it. And most of them were crew. And he swam over to it. And on the first side that he approaches, he asks, can I get on? And they push him off. This is not an uncommon story with that night. What happened? They would push people away. And, in one instance, one of the things that I was really inspired by with relation to that is, someone says as they're pushed away from a lifeboat, he says, that's all right, boys. Keep cool. Good luck and God bless you. And again, Scott, I just think, would you have the strength to say that as you're being pushed away from a lifeboat? And that was not Charles. That was another passenger that someone told during the British inquiry that someone had responded that way. We don't know who it was. In the case of Charles, another great life lesson, about getting along with our coworkers and caring about our coworkers as friends. Sometimes it really pays off. He was spotted by a cook, Isaac Maynard, who was on the collapsible lifeboat that Charles was trying to get on. And he reaches out his hand to Charles. At this point, Charles is already on the other side, the second side of the lifeboat, where he's trying again, come on, guys, I got to get on. I got to get on. And Isaac Maynard reaches his hand out to Charles. And, can you imagine taking that risk? That would be an incredible risk when you're fighting for your own life out there on an overturned lifeboat that's full of men, that's pushing people off. Well, a little while goes by, probably about 20 minutes maybe, and all of a sudden they hear a voice from out in the dark. There are all these lifeboats out in the dark, and they're doing things like lighting ropes to be able to see whatever they can, but they wouldn't be able to see very far. And Charles hears a voice. We can take 10 more. He hears somebody from another lifeboat. We can take 10 more. And immediately he jumps on it, even though he's so tired at this point and hypothermia is already setting in. And he says to Isaac Maynard, "Let go me hand." And Isaac lets it go. And Charles is one of the 10 that gets on that lifeboat. Again, a moment probably when many of us would have thought, oh, to heck with it. I don't have the strength to swim over there. He found the strength. He got over there and he got on a lifeboat. He was picked up by the Carpathia, as were all of the survivors. The Carpathia, of course, was the ship, the hero ship that risked everything to go through this field of little icebergs and big icebergs, and this whole field of different sizes of nothing but danger to it, to try to save these people. When Charles gets picked up, he is so cold and his feet are so swollen. They have to put him into an oven, believe it or not. Yes. And he says, they popped me into the oven like one of my own pies. And that is how Charles survives.
And how long was he treading water at this point when he was trying to find a ship or a lifeboat to be able to enter?
Well, he says that in all, he was treading water about 2 hours, but that must include the time where he was holding Isaac Maynard's hand, because he was not up on the lifeboat. He was in the water. So 2 hours total.
You know, it's funny, when you were telling that story, I had heard the account of him as some sort of silly fun fact about history that, oh, did you hear about the man who drank so much he was able to survive in the cold water? And I don't think the human body works that way. It's not as if you go into some sort of hibernative state by drinking more and you have a higher cold tolerance that allows you to survive better. From what you read of his life, though, what do you think caused him to be able to survive? And if you haven't read anything, I'm just curious from your own speculation or your own inference on his life, why do you think he was able to make it? Was it that he just kept his cool and didn't panic? Did he have a physical hardiness that maybe other people would have frozen by then and he didn't? So why do you think he was able to survive?
Well, a couple of factors. Number one being his age. You know, he was 33. I know someone said to me once years ago, you're perfect at 30. You know, she made that comment when I was turning 30. That's like your perfect age. You're like in the best shape. You know, you've experienced enough of life, and you're at that point where you are still full of hope. He had 2 little babies at home in Southampton. I'm sure, wanted to go back to see them. He was very hardy. His family shared with me that he, you know, was not the greatest looking guy. He was kind of rough and tumble. And they actually told me that he looked a little bit like a prize boxer, that kind of physique. And like I said, that's why I shared those personal stories of my own, because I have found incredible inspiration from this man by learning his story and the truth about it.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Afterwards, as he's a somewhat young man at this time, he has long years ahead of him. He can work. So what happens to him after the Titanic disaster?
Well, he continues working on the sea. Can you imagine? I mean, that's another great life lesson to us about his wherewithal. He was even on the SS Congress ship when it caught fire in Coos Bay, Oregon on Thursday, September 14th, 2000. I'm sorry, you're going to have to edit that out. It's not 2000. One of the passengers, Barbara Colgrove, was traveling on the Congress from her home in Seattle, and she was alone when when the disaster occurred, and she was with 4 children, all under the age of 10. And she told the Associated Press that Joughin was incredible in assisting a great many people. And then she heard that he had fallen overboard. So what happened to Joughin after all of his experiences? He moved to New Jersey, believe it or not, in 1920. His wife had passed away, giving birth to their son. And he moved to New Jersey and married a woman named Annie Ripley. They lived in Paterson, New Jersey. And there he worked with food as well after many years of working on the oceans. So Charles worked in many capacities in New Jersey, including even with hot dogs at one point, as his family shared with me. And he continued to bake. He baked mincemeat pies. When his wife Annie would ask him for one, he didn't just make one, he'd make 30. And he loved to make lemon pies slathered in dazzling, fluffy meringue. He learned to bake on the Isle of Man, where the Joughin Bakery was. And it was located at 8 Michael Street. And what, interestingly enough, is tied to Charles is that at the Titanic wreck site, a plate from the Isle of Man steam packet company was found. And people wondered, well, where did this come from? How did this get on the Titanic? But as I mentioned earlier about those jerry-rigged stills that would be in the crew quarters, there was probably a stash of dishes that they would bring with them too, or a few things that they had collected along the way. So the assumption could be, thinking of Charles as, tucking away a plate from the one of his journeys on the steam packet company ships, or not ships, they're on the steam packet company. Charles was very quiet about his experiences that night. He never spoke about them. That's why he made up the story about the polar bear. And he waited until the 1950s to open up about what happened that night. And the reason he did at that point was because he saw or heard about an article in the Ladies' Home Journal that was calling for accounts from survivors of the Titanic by a man named Walter Lord. Walter Lord was beginning the research for his book, his classic now, A Night to Remember. And there was an article about it in the Ladies' Home Journal that Charles saw. And he responded through the help of a translator. One of the negative aspects of him not, being able to be in school full time as a child was that he needed help reading and writing. And so some of the information that he shared with Walter Lord might have been lost in translation, but he was able to work with help of a translator to get a great majority of the truth to him. And that information was in the book, A Night to Remember. And that's why we see him in the movie, A Night to Remember, and also in the James Cameron Titanic movie. So it's interesting the way this man was able to open up finally with people about what happened beyond the British inquiry, of course, because of a call from a journalist, an author like Walter Lord.
All right. Well, thank you for talking about his life. And in most shows, we would end there. But on this show, because we talk about the culinary history of the Titanic as well, we're going to look at Charles's contribution to our unsinkable drinking, dining, and style guide. So, Veronica, when you were looking at his life, how did you want to match up his life to a particular recipe, and what came out?
Well, Scott, I loved when I found out from his great niece how Charles used to make beautiful chocolate painted eclairs. And ironically, chocolate eclairs were on the first class menu on that last night of the Titanic sailing. And so it just was the perfect recipe to include in this story. And for the recipe contributor, Gail Gand, she's a pastry chef, author, teacher, and a James Beard Award winner. She's based in Chicago. She really loves the whole story of the Titanic because she's felt inspired by it as well. She, loves England and studying England, and she contributed this recipe for mini eclairs. And this is a wonderful recipe for many reasons. One of them is that they're very passable at a party. You can make small eclairs instead of the great big long ones you see at the bakery, but they're small enough that you can put a tray out or have a tray passed around at a party, and they're absolutely delicious. They include Gail's recipe for pâte à choux, which is the puff part of the pastry, and it's the pastry puff, and it's also a splendid nod to the prevailing French food that we know was aboard the Titanic at all meals.
All right. So that really kicks it up a gear when you say that this is the specific food that was on the Titanic. So you'll just blow people's minds with that.
Yeah, we don't know for sure, of course, what those French chefs were working with for a recipe for those eclairs. And I would venture to guess it's similar, though.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And if people want the full recipe, they can go to the show notes for our page, which I'll mention here in a second. So, Veronica, thanks for sharing all this. And that wraps up our first episode diving into the specific life of someone on the Titanic. In the next episode, we're going to be moving on to the cooks and the ice cream makers. See you there. Thanks for listening to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. To listen to all the episodes in the series, go to lastnightonthetitanicpodcast.com. There you'll also find show notes, biographical profiles of the passengers and crew on the Titanic, and recipes for all the recipe spotlights that we do in the series. One last thing, if you like the show, please rate and review it on the podcast listener of your choice. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.